Hello. Hello. Alrighty then. Let me just load up another web page for me to refer to. It'll probably be GitHub in case I need to answer questions about plugins. And open a couple of observations that I have to communicate to my live stream peoples. And we're going to go to live chat unless we can't handle it and have to do something else. I have still got some video making work to do and stuff, but all things considered, I think that we're about ready to roll. So hi. Hey there, David. So you got my latest message? I only have so many tempos that I can use, but I can try the 128 beat per minute tempo. The thing about that is I have been doing much closer to like 120 BPM on the grounds of the music that I'm doing has been more tending to be more chilled and meditative and stuff. Well, I'm not sure what use it is, although kind of think of it, no, I can't think of something that might be worth doing. Don't mind me, I'll be tinkering with stuff myself. Namely, actually I think it'll give me an option. So that's 44.1K, so I can do something here, which I've been meaning to do, and it's this. I had been wanting to do a uncompressed capture of my mic just occasionally that I would hopefully forget I was doing, so that if I wanted to later, I could have a uncompressed audio voice clip using this little microphone that I use, just so that I can go pillage it later and be like, oh, okay, here is a close mic recording of me saying in a very natural and unaffected way, oh, that'll never work, or something like that. And make samples out of that stuff, much like you're talking about doing. Because initially it seemed really weird to me that you wanted to do like live streamed music composition based off of my talking streams. But there's been lots of crazy stuff that's been done with talking streams, so this would be no exception. And if you can do it, so can I. So if you end up hearing like me coming across in a music stream at some point, it might not actually be me live. It might be samples of me being messed up with something or other. Yeah, you hang around with the right crew and you wind up doing all kinds of crazy experiments and things. And that is the cases of that. Yeah, bear in mind, I'm going to compel you to be completely illegal with all of it. You're not getting like rights to use my existence, and that would make you like a record company with Prince, where you say do the wrong thing and all of a sudden it's like, oh hi, this guy has like literally rights to everything that you do and rights to use of your name, and That's what happened with Prince when he did that crazy, which turned out not so crazy if you know about it. That bizarre, unpronounceable symbol that he went to was actually like music industry machinations. What that was about was the record company owned Prince's music, and they owned Prince's stage name, and they owned any possible name Prince would choose in future by terms of his contract. So he couldn't actually change his name or do anything else. And so that was what caused the seemingly crazy, wacky, and you'll notice that the media never covered that part. That is what produced the crazy, wacky artist behavior of picking this strange name, was that it was his rebellion against the record company that owned any possible name that he could use. So he's like, fine, you own any possible name? Here, took on this one. And forced them to cope with that as, his formal name for, which wasn't in any font, so they couldn't actually make any press releases using it. I admire stuff like that. Like, industry stories about things like that are kind of cool. It's like I ran across somewhere or other the green M&M story, or I think it was brown M&M story, which was a Van Halen story, and it's often spun yep, exactly. He made it artistly formerly known as Prince and used the weird symbol because the record company owned any possible name that he would choose, and it was his form of rebellion. I'm looking at my telephone and I'm tempted to try to pull the plug on the thing. Hang on. Maybe what I'll do instead is kill the answering machine of it. There we go. See, that way I can at least guarantee that if any criminals and scam artists, as they so often have done, called during this stream, and if I'm looking at the camera I can kind of see the light go off, I can at least know that they're getting absolutely nowhere. So I think I'm seeing questions already. Let me peek at what the... if I mute my sound but turn on the stream, I can see kind of what's been going on. Or apparently not. Okay, that's fine. I don't need to monitor the stream, I only need to make it. We're good. Let me start handling actual questions, because that's mainly what I'm here to do today, although there are other things that I could end up doing in other days, and I'll be telling you about that momentarily. Zafor has a question. Actually, if I wanted to see what was coming across on the stream, so what I should do is skip over to OBS, and boom, there we go. No pun intended. And in fact, I have a correction for you, but I'll get to that in a moment. Using one corner clip instead of a D clip is not in any way abuse. You're completely entitled to do that. It might very well be the best thing for some things. One corner clip is a very good choice for some kinds of finalizing, because it's a sort of dirtier sound, and that is going to work out fairly well for some tracks. So that's not any kind of abuse. That is use as intended. You should be able to do that just fine. Marshall Zukov, and some of you guys might end up going away if I switch away from live chat, but for the time being I'm going to hold it in there and we'll see what we get. I am a Gen Xer. I am what they call the Atari wave of Gen X. I was born in 1968. I'm over 50 years old. That doesn't make me a boomer, because the Atari wave of Gen X was when you were almost on the last wave of boomers, but slightly younger than all of that. So you missed out on literally all of that stuff and don't have any sense of participation in that generation or whatever. Personality-wise, you're not like that at all. And as you were growing up, your childhood involved the very earliest game consoles, like Ataris and Nintendos and stuff. They talk about it being Atari Wave and Nintendo Wave, because Atari Wave was like folks born in 1968. And then Nintendo was a few years past that, so it would be folks born in literally the early 70s. Around the early 70s, the boomers were having their teenage years rather than getting born, so there is a distinction there. Gen X is one of the most sparse generations. There are not many Gen Xers out there. Contains some of the best and some of the worst people, and we tend to have really problematic opinions of various kinds. But more really, Gen X tends to be just extreme in various ways. Like the thing that I'm doing with Air Windows is a extreme kind of left-wing project in which I'm very much putting stuff out there, and it is not designed about like how much I can get coming back to me. It's about what I can give, what I can put out there, and being a good Gen Xer, I'm willing to push harder than most people will do in order to make that happen. I think another possible Gen Xer would be guys like Martin Shkreli, whose his way of doing his thing is buying up pharmaceutical companies and then jacking up the price by thousands of %. And which he does just as aggressively as I do my Air Windows plugins. It's like same kind of ferocity of attack and totally different principles and themes. So that's kind of what you can expect out of Gen X. It's like ruthless outperformance of anything else. There aren't many of us, so that's kind of part of the way that works out. And you got to sort of pick your poison, because you can have people doing very good things, you can have people doing very bad things. And none of them are as full of themselves as boomers typically are. It's just like, well, this is we were doing the very first experience of what millennials now experience, like with employment and economics and everything basically collapsing. Everything literally collapsed under us. It's just that we are scarce enough that it really started to become noticed when it was millennials being sabotaged, but we got the first wave of that. Trust me on that. So I would agree with Marshall Zukov in some ways. Yeah, boomer destroy world. Let me keep skipping around. Vladimir, I'm not sure whether you're a real deal or not. If you are, welcome. If you're not a troll, that is cool too. And I am the guy playing guitar on Tuesdays. I like including that in my music. So I also make plugins that support guitar. And so, yep, I am one of your guitar people. I've also made pretty much all of these. They're generally not store-bought. Let's see, the purple one, I worked on the pickup and put the neck in. That is the neck that I grew up playing. I've had that neck for like more than 30 years. That's not a real SG, that's a Samick. And the pickups are glued in place because I opened it out so that it would fit P90s. And yeah, it's very slightly scalloped. The Telecaster is probably a real Telecaster, but it's made out of weird parts and it's all junky and the body is terrible. And the metal parts are all rusted, but it sounds amazing. So it's one of those weird sort of Franken guitars. The white one I built all myself. The body I've had for many years. And the neck I got from a guy who had heavily scalloped it. If you want, I can anybody who wants more information about these things. So that's a very heavily scalloped neck on the white one. And I got the pickups. I bought them from a pickup winder that I know about, who did really good work, and he sells these like classic Gibson style humbuckers at the right impedance. And then the one in the very end, which I've been gravitating towards recently, is some kind of Fender Fat Strat body that used to go with the neck with the white headstock, and the neck used to go with, I think, the purple guitar. I'm not really sure. And the pick guard and pickups I've had for a long time, and they're Lindy Frall and Wines on magnets that I already had. So pretty all of these things I just built from pieces and stuff. Acoustics, not so much. The acoustics are a cheap Alvarez, a cheap Fender, a cheap Harmony Broadway archtop, and then over in the very end, there's an Ibanez archtop copy that's partly assembled at the moment. And the Fender, which is a nylon string, has a broken piece inside it that rattles sometimes. And yeah, they're like $200 guitars, but they sounded good. So that is the story of the guitars. Is if you like instruments, you can build stuff, and I suggest that you do so. So let's see. Chris Cadwell, my question is, what is the point of making music? I don't know. I like noises. That is the bottom line, is if you like certain kinds of noises and people aren't making those noises for you, you can go and make them yourself. And I like listening to noises. I've been listening to lots of dub techno recently. And let's see. Let's keep going. Yeah, David Pixley, who is the one who showed up on one of my streams. David Pixley is involved with Pixelgasm, and that is the voice that turned up on one of my streams. If he ever objects to it, I'll pull that particular stream offline, because I have no permission to use his stuff any more than he has permission to use mine. We're just hacking each other back and forth sometimes. David is using mini clippers. I never really understood that, but... And David's buddies are using circuit-bent Game Boys. That sounds like great fun. So yeah, we're going to keep going after some of these questions and things. Cosmic Feed has a real-sounding question. That is, how can I emulate a transformer sound? Do I have a transformery plugin? My answer to that is not yet. Not in the sense you mean. Oh, he's got to cook now? Okay. For future reference, I don't have a good transformery plugin yet. This is something I've been meaning to do, because what I mean to do is set up some test signals and run them through my Motu, run them through the digital audio converter at, say, 192K and 24-bit. And what I'll need to do is do a loop through analog circuits and use those test signals to experiment with various transformers and see what I can get them to do. If I can get the transformers to do stuff with samples and then measure what changes in the samples, then I can mimic that in software, which I typically do not by painstakingly reproducing, like, not with a sample-based or way of doing it, but more like coming up with an algorithm that is going to match what was being done. So that is the transformer thing. I have every intention of getting into that at some point. Just under that, my live music guitar stream or synthesizer stream or whatever is tomorrow at this time. I've been talking to... One of the reasons I think David Pixley is going to go places, even though I have to scold him really hard sometimes, is that this is a guy that just bounces back and has lots of energy and ideas. And was asking, like, what tempo do you use? You need to tell me what tempo you use so that we can coordinate stuff. And I'm like, we're not coordinating anything. But I was like, I can do 120, 124, and 128. He's like, do 120. I'm like, okay. So I'm going to try doing 128 BPM tomorrow, and we'll see what a slightly more up-tempo guitar thingy comes out like. And just below that, Vladimir Moskovsky, the technology is the tomato. I suppose so. You got a lot of memes in here. I don't think they let you put any particularly. I shouldn't say that. Somebody will come up with a way of doing it. They will meme. Guitar is almost as good as USA rap. I've heard some rap that I thought was very good. In particular, a Tribe Called Quest did a bunch of really amazing things with different styles and flavors of rap. And I'm particularly fond of the We Got the Jazz into Buggin' Out. That is an amazing track. It's an amazing classic hip-hop track from one of the old Tribe Called Quest albums. And it starts out with this very chill thing, which is rap, but the whole emotion of it is very different from what you usually get. And then there's this drum fill, and it goes into this super aggressive, very classic rap performance by Phife Dawg that in the video he's wearing these ping pong balls on his eyes, and it's just amazing over these bright primary colors. And yeah, there's some great stuff in there. Happy Guy, do I have quick demos? No, not really. That's one of the costs of producing output this fast, is in some ways I need to rely upon other people being able to process it all. And in some ways, that's why I started doing this live stream. So if you have questions about it, then ask me now. I will do my level best to answer them. So a VST to mimic circuit bent Game Boys. I have had plans for doing a circuit bend VST. You would probably like it. It would be some folks would be very well suited by this particular thing I have got in mind. Marshall, you got to stop doing that, or I'll just change away from live chat. I have indeed done circuit bending some of the time. And there are certain kinds of circuits and devices that suit better for doing circuit bending. For instance, you can get these old Casio keyboards and things, and they're using digital to analog chips, but they're using such primitive old chips that it's like the individual bits on the bus that are going back and forth through the chips are on individual circuit traces. So you can wire it around to do terrible, strange things with individual bits of the output word, and that's what gives you some of the really weird circuit bendy stuff. As far as things like speak and spells, with those it's more about circuit bending the sample rate, distorting things, just doing stuff that is you're not necessarily breaking up the individual bit structure of the output words before they hit the DAC, but you're doing things like dropping the speed of the pitch of the synthesized voice while keeping the formats the way they are. So yeah, I'm very drawn to circuit bendy stuff, although I feel that it's probably the kind of thing that would limit my output. Like, I wouldn't be thinking of guitar noises that went along with it because they wouldn't go along with it. It would be just like, okay, now we're doing circuit bending now, and that's what it's going to be. Let me move on a little bit. Some of this stuff that you guys are talking about, I would have to switch away from that if it started taking over, because those aren't questions that I can answer. I don't know what gray banners are. Emulating a console-like mix, I use Purist Channel Bus accordingly, and you're using Transdesk for coloration, which is good. That works. Can you add the console 5? Do you mean channel 5? Because bear in mind, I have my terminology around that is confusing, unnecessarily confusing, I might add. You've got console, and console is the one that has two sections. And channel came before I invented console. And I've been doing different versions of it just to illustrate what my basic audio of the plugin sounds like. I've been using it as a test bed where only thing that changes is the stuff that I do around noise shaping or the stuff that I do around, denormal numbers and such. And that's the only part that would change, up to the most recent version, which did actually change and be different. So if you're using Transdesk, you can use literally channel in any version, in any place, the same place as you would put Transdesk. It's not part of a combination of things. It's its own little tone shaper. So if you were looking for a somewhat SSLE kind of voicing, you can use channel anywhere you want to put that in. Now, doing a console, like using Purist console channel, Purist console bus, is the kind of thing where you have the one on the output of your audio channels and the other one in the beginning of the 2 bus. And that's totally a separate thing. Like you can use whichever version of channel or desk you want in any place in all of those things, and it'll just change the sound a little bit. So yes, you can. You can use channel 5 Purist console channel on individual tracks. Absolutely. There was a version of a console that came earlier, console 4, where you could use bus colors for on tracks and entirely replace the channel section. Hey, Martin. Yeah, Martin wishes to send me music and does pretty decent housey type music stuff. A fan and does good work. So let me continue dealing with questions. And I still haven't given you guys the announcement I was thinking about doing. I'm ready to do so. I'll work my way up to that after I answer enough questions. So is Crystal for mastering? Not especially. Crystal is for one particular guy who was so in love with it that he just kept bugging me about it. And that doesn't always work. Sometimes that just makes me stop doing it. But in this case, I knew I wanted to put that class of plugin out there. And it would be a bit of a head start in terms of getting it done. So Crystal is kind of like a old school coloration plugin, much like Channel 5 or whatever it is. And you could use it for mastering, but it's mostly just a color adder alterer, and I usually don't consider mastering as being about the color changers. That's kind of a rookie game, is to use to try to change the tone of things in mastering. What mastering is really about is retaining the color of the original track while manipulating it anyway. Especially in terms of loudness and manipulating that, but also in terms of if you need to manipulate the tonality of it, can you retain the same tonal colors that it has? And do your tonal manipulations in a very transparent way. Like a guy that I know, Dave Collins, who I think I mentioned on the dither discussion at one point, he truly deeply hated an early version of my dithering stuff. The precursor for the vinyl dither, in fact. Dave Collins is known for having come up with a design for a very simple sort of Pultec style EQ in which everything can be switched around, and it is this sort of ultimate transparent colorless EQ where you can put anything through it and basically lose nothing. And if you need to shape the tonality of a track, you run it through Dave Collins' device, I forget what he called it, and do your tonal shaping, which will tend to be in a very subtle way. and all of the original color of the music and the previous mix comes through without that being altered in any way. So that Dave is a very well-respected and high-priced mastering dude. So that is a sort of a high bar. Other kinds of high-priced mastering dudes are people like Vlado Meller from back in the day. Vlado was responsible for Californication, the Red Hot Chili Peppers album that kind of redefined loudness war for people. And that's another way that you can do the mastering thing, is by just getting good at making stuff impossibly loud. So let me see now. What else have we got? Hard vacuum could be used for mastering. I think hard vacuum would be slightly more suitable for mastering, but even then, the stuff that it's doing is maybe a little bit too striking. Like using stuff like aura and the hard vacuum's warmth setting is arguably too much of a change. If you were going to try to do asymmetrical stuff in mastering, you might be looking more towards a single-ended triode and its Class A slider for that. Or alternately, maybe Paf Nutty might be a thing. Or if you wanted to be heavy-handed, Purest Warm. But yeah, that's the kind of stuff that you can do. So yeah, folks hanging out and talking, this might be a good idea for me to introduce the thing I was going to tell you about. Namely, a Patreon goal for a third stream. I wonder whether I'm going to start using these pieces of paper. I suppose if somebody asks me something where I need to draw the answer, I will do that. I have already put in place some revised Patreon goals. If you went to there, you would see that now it looks different. It's no longer talking about releasing more plugins as open source, because I've basically already done that. I had to come up with farther goals because the stuff that I have been promising, I have been over-delivering on the promising. So I'll say like, oh, we need to, this and this and this can become open source as a goal when I reach a certain point, but then I've been giving it anyway. Everything is now open sourced except for the stuff that hasn't come out yet, and that's coming out at a pretty good clip, so that's ceasing to be interesting. Therefore, the new goal is, I got two new goals. And here is the first one. I'll find it on my desktop and I'll read it out. This is what I've got as the official wording on the Patreon site. I intend to observe this wording very carefully, because the stuff that I've put out as part of a goal and written down there, I feel like I'm going to be held to it word for word. So, at $1,500 a month, which is not going to happen immediately, but at some point I think it will, I will add a third live stream to my schedule. 11 o'clock EST Wednesdays, so it's the same time as these other live streams, but it'll be a Wednesday one in addition to the Monday and Tuesday. And it will study evergreen records and analyze 1 minute from a classic hit song for 2 hours of stream time. You might notice that this is something that I did in a previous stream. Some of you might have caught it. So you can see a little bit of an example of me looking at several different tracks and things on, I forget exactly which one, but an earlier stream. Wasn't last week, maybe the week before. This is the same study recently mentioned in the New York Times, but using better analysis tools, and you'll hear part of the music and learn how it was done. So I am going to be prepared to play the audio I'm talking about over the stream, knowing that that might possibly cause a problem because you can't really get much more fair use than playing the music, talking over it, playing only 1 minute out of the center of the song or out of some place in the song, and not playing the rest of the music is pretty hardcore, obviously fair use. But I mean, I'm dealing with record companies, so God knows what's going to happen. But we'll see. Because the thing is, I am not a large enough channel to be able to protest anything that they do. So it could be a thing of, I don't think anybody has the technology to like shut down my stream for, although I don't know, we'll find out. It might end up being a thing where I cannot actually play the audio for you. But we can try. I'm willing to try, because this is something that is worth doing, and it seems as if it would be worthwhile letting people hear what is actually so different. I'm talking about playing the audio from classic records that sold millions of copies, sampled off of the vinyl versions, using the bizarre, heavily modified turntable that I built for myself. I built my own tone arm, and I've been doing stuff like that for many years. So, and no, I would not be comparing the songs to the best clips of my live music audio, because I've just learned from this kind of stuff. It's not as if it's a specific reference in that way. But that is what I'll do if we get to $1,500 a month, is I will start trying to do this very analytical thing of letting you hear just a little snippet out of the middle of the music, and I'll probably need to talk over it, at least in a subtle way, to keep the automated stuff from jumping all over me. And certainly minimizing the amount of time spent playing it is also part of that recipe. But the rest of it will be using those analytical tools that you saw on a couple of weeks ago, in which you'll be able to see what the dynamic range actually was for this stuff back in the day. Like, it's all normalized so that the hottest peak is at 0. And you'll see just how much crest factor, will become the crest factory, by God. How much headroom, basically, is available over the RMS loudness, the basic loudness of things. And then I've also got a whole raft of other measurements and stuff, which has not yet found its way into a metering plugin. Nobody has this. It's only me that has this, and it's only running on an antique laptop, the PPC processor. And it doesn't run in real time, it runs in batch processing at about like 1/5 to 1/10 real-time speed. But I'm willing to do this. If I can't play the audio, then what I can do is do the studies and show you pictures of the measurements of these things. And I'm fully prepared to do that. That's what I was doing the last time this stuff showed up on the stream. The measurements I'm talking about involve a sort of color meter thing that I worked out that balances how optimal the RMS loudness is versus what the slew rate is, like how bright it is compared to how loud it is. And then there's a third measurement for microdynamics, the third measurement for small fluctuations of loudness, with the idea that it'll sort of combine. S2P, if you start trolling on me, I'm going to switch away from live chat. So one of the meters is showing you a color that supposedly would average out to white for a perfect balance of full intensity of all of those things. And if, say, you're low on brightness, it'll have less green. You'll wind up with a more purple, red, or blue color for if stuff is darker than it could be. And then the remaining two measurements are a plotting of slew rate over time, which forms areas that, I mean, you see a whole different behavior on this kind of stuff. It's not the way that we normally look at audio, but it's useful. And then lastly, there is a chart that is space between zero crossings over time. So if you have large base energy, it will cause there to be more space between zero crossings, especially if it balances out, it's heavier rather than brighter. And the way that works out is your hit records have a very, depending upon the kind of record, like Pink Floyd Dark Side of the Moon tends to have a very even distribution, and it tends to have a particular look to it. Whereas more rock and roll type stuff might have a very different look to it. Boston's first album, there are sections in there where the time between zero crossings goes to this very even band that's strictly an upper level, and it's the sort of, that's the balance that you would get if you were going for just loud rock and roll mayhem mixed pretty much perfectly. So these are new measurements, and I have the 1 minute plots for 100 classic records all ready to go. And that's going to happen if I get to the 1500 mark. So that's a new goal. We don't have to worry about that just yet. At least I don't think I do. But if I do manage to get up there, then we'll start doing that and we'll see how that works out. Then there is another goal, and that's more interesting and kind of more interactive for you guys. If I do get to $2,000 a month, and if it goes any farther than that, I'll think of something else new to do. But at $2,000 a month, I will turn over part of that Evergreens live stream, which will be 11 o'clock Eastern Standard Time on Wednesdays, to patron content. So if you're at the $50 a year level or higher, like as if you would buy one plugin each year or more, then for each level, for each like the plugin that you would get, you also get this other bonus thing, which is you can give me a 1 minute clip of your own music, much like Martin has already done, and get a 2-hour live stream dedicated to studying your music and engineering. And I'll run it through the same process that people don't have available, and it's not out there to be used, and it's not in the open source stuff either. You can't get it from going into the Air Windows GitHub. Hey, Morphe. So at that goal level, I'll start going and dedicating the Evergreen live streams to patron music, and you'll get a 2-hour session on Wednesdays dedicated to your stuff, and it'll turn into a conversation where I'll do everything that I can to help you develop your craft, and we'll be working on the audio that you'll probably be able to. I can't imagine that the people who are my patrons would freak out over me playing their 1 minute clip over the internet and having people hear what it is that they do. Generally, the people, I have never run across anybody that uses my plugins that I guess they just gravitate to it because they like their ears better than using their eyes for mixing. And it seems to always correspond to people being pretty good at what they do. I haven't run across an exception yet. Everybody is doing pretty good at what they do in here. So the people who are doing the equivalent of multiples of $50 a year will get that many possible slots per year for a spotlight as kind of an extra thing, an extra bonus from what they were able to give. And there's a maximum of 52 of those. And it may just take over from the Evergreen thing. I don't know whether the Evergreen thing is going to pose enormous problems for me. I got to find out. I will find out. It's kind of scary. The thing about it is that if record companies start booting me off for doing fair use and analysis and praise of their greatest works, I can only survive so many copyright strikes before my Air Windows YouTube video is threatened, and that's no fun. So if they were kicking my stream offline or kicking the saved streams offline, I'd kind of have to let them do that. So we'll pretty much see. I mean, if I'm lucky, it would lead to publicity as far as explaining how you can't get much more fair use and study of a thing than doing a kind of scholarly measurement of all these different qualities and playing only an excerpt of the song and repeatedly studying the things that the sound does. It's pretty hard to get more fair use than that. Like, we're not even finishing or beginning the damn song. We're just playing a snippet. But that people will mess with you sometimes. So I'll just have to see where it goes. And I'll see what transpires and whether that's something that I can continue to do. But I'm willing to give it a shot. I think it'd be worth it, and I think there'd be very interesting things to be learned. Because the neat thing about it is, I've been a student of production and engineering for kind of a long time, and a lot of this stuff, there's literature out there as far as how things were done. Like a number of these albums that I'm studying, I've got things like books on the production of the albums or on the band, or I have an enormous quantity of the classic album series from Eagle Rock, and those are very revealing as far as explaining some of the things. I am a sucker for documentaries of things. So even without necessarily playing the music, I probably can come up with 2 hours of stuff to say about 1 minute worth of music. That's kind of the point. It's kind of, that's the idea, is being able to go really deep with everything that I've learned about production and the history of recording. If I know what kinds of recorders were being used, I'll tell you. If I know things about the gear that was being done, or the way that they set up the drums, or changes in, like, for the Beatles, there's a change between White Album and Abbey Road in which they changed consoles from a tube console to a transistor console, and it gave them a very different sound and a different behavior. And I have read hundreds of books on all of these things and studied it all super hard because I'm deeply fascinated by it all. So I will share everything that I know. Everything that I can, like the way that they, like Tom Petty's Damn the Torpedoes album, and the way that they set up the snare drum in order to get that snare drum that they used on there. Anything I've learned, I will share. So there's sure to be 2 hours worth of content out of each of these things. And it's also promotion, but nobody in the music business cares about free audio going out and considering it promotion. So this is going to be a weird ride. We'll just see what happens, I guess. So there you go. That is the $1,500 a month goal, is starting to do these evergreen records, and at $2,000 a month, the Evergreens Wednesday stream starts getting turned over to patron content. And I think that'll be, because one of the things about it is I don't like charging for stuff that can be distributed for free. I don't like charging for plugins when people can copy around the plugins and use them in the open sources out there and stuff. And it's like, how can I charge for that? That's going out into the stream of everything. But me working on stuff and spending my time to do things does count, because I only have so much of that. I'm a Gen Xer, old fart. A bunch of us, like Luke Perry, Fife Dog, have conked out already, that are just around my age group. So it's like, I'm going to try to take care of myself and make sure that I can keep doing this for a while. But there's only so much time that I have to do any of these things. So I got to choose wisely. And if I choose to take people's house music tracks and a 1 minute clip of that and do this analysis and then spend 2 hours talking about it, well, that'll be part of a goal. If I stay over this like income stream for the Patreon, I'll consider that like, working for my living, basically. So, yeah. And Martin gets a little bit of a freebie because Martin was like, I must show you this song that I composed for you. And a lot of people will actually do that. So I will run out of the ability to, as things get more popular and people more and more increasingly learn that I'm doing this, the percentages of people who are like, I love you very much and I must compose for you, that'll just continue to grow. And it'll become such a large percentage that I won't be able to listen to all the things. But for now, I'm hanging in there. And Martin did some pretty good house music, I gotta say. So, as far as me making, spending time making music, one of the reasons that I am doing Air Windows rather than being a band or a musician is that music is a kind of outlet, but mostly I'm interested in the gear. It was begun with an experience I think I've talked about before, but I can tell you about it again. Two experiences, really. One of them was this. When I was very young, I was a little kid, and I got earwax in my ears. It sort of built up. And it built up to the point where my hearing was seriously impaired, but also it started to hurt. It was like impacted and stuff. And I had this extremely traumatic experience where I had to go to the hospital, and there's this huge, terrifying, like, water gun syringe thing. And I more or less had a complete freak out, but managed to hang out, survive it without, like, physically attacking the doctor or anything like that. I was not big enough to do so anyway. And they blasted the crap out of my ears with water jets in order to blow the impacted earwax out. And it was the most traumatic, horrible thing ever. It was very painful. It was terrifying. It was deafening. And it was just like, oh my God, I went to war and lost. And survived the experience. And I'm riding home in the car, like with my dad. I think it was my dad, who was very cross with me for misbehaving in the doctor's office and being such a wuss. And that was upsetting. And then I realized that I was hearing stuff that I never, ever heard before. Like, there were tiny noises inside the car door. There was music on the radio, if I'm not mistaken, and I was hearing things in the music. I think there was like Beatles, something off of Abbey Road that was playing, and I was like, oh my goodness. And I was fascinated. And I had been putting together, even as a little child, a crazy homebrew stereo system that began with like a turntable and a tube amplifier that was actually mono that my dad had built long ago. And he was letting me use it, although he was like, don't take it apart. It has dangerous voltages inside, which of course it did. And I was accumulating speakers. I had this like 15-inch woofer that was more a PA system speaker, and assorted other kinds of speakers and things like that. And I was like cobbling them together into this weird series parallel wiring of all these different speakers wired into this amplifier. I probably did a good job of blowing up and hurting the amplifier because the impedance mismatch was terrible, but I didn't know that at the time. All I knew was I was able to wire together this stuff where I could play vinyl records. And some of the first vinyl records that I ever got were through like Columbia Record Club back in the day that they were doing that. I think I got their initial records and then got my parents to say, oh, he's a minor, he's not actually able to do this, and I got out of paying them. But I got Talking Heads Speaking in Tongues, and I got George Thorogood and the Delaware Destroyers' first album, I think. I had Iron Maiden's Power Slave, and I remember being so intimidated by it that I didn't feel I could actually listen to it because it's like, oh, this is so clearly bad and wrong. I'll get in trouble for this, so I better not play it very loudly. And I just had this assortment of weird records from various places. And then I discovered prog rock, and I started buying Yes records and completely fell in love with those. And, this is around time that I got into drugs, and I ended up getting into drugs so hardcore that I had to stop later in life. But I did that whole thing of like diving into record listening. But I also did the thing of building my own stuff, building my own speaker designs. And one of my earliest experiences were with a mono tube amplifier that's probably pretty good sounding, honestly. Probably was. And just being able to go really deep into these classic vinyl records, some of the best records out there. And very high dynamic range, of course. Well, when I came home from the hospital having my ears blasted with the water jets to unclog them, oh, Bernard, there is a daylight savings time thing that happened. Sorry about that. That is an American thing. Maybe it's not happening in where you're at, but that is a thing, sadly. And hopefully YouTube does a good job of communicating it. Anyways, the getting home from the hospital after having had my ears assaulted with water jets and unclogged, I dove into my records, and it was a transformative experience. I clearly had stuff that was interesting enough to completely fascinate me, and I was never really the same. I was always interested in building speakers, building things, making these constructions that would give me different stuff out of the music. And I've always done that. So it's never been only about me making music. It's also been about me experiencing music and identifying the stuff that I thought was amazing. And I've formed a lot of opinions about those, which hopefully will enter into the Evergreens thing when we get to that point, and I can start doing the Evergreen studies. Now, the other transformative thing about me diving into audio and gear rather than just performing music was this. I was super into my records and stuff. And I was a young, feisty person, kind of like David Pexley is now, and just definitely maybe a bit of a troll, very aggressive, and I had strong opinions about stuff at just around the time that CDs started coming out. And I'd been building my vinyl record stuff up to the point where I figured it was good. Bernard has noticed, yes, I have rearranged the studio. I'll be using it tomorrow in this way. I even have some other stuff. I have built a whole... here, let me... I'll shut these down. I'll switch over to OBS. Check this out. No, don't be stuck. Ta-da! The system is now a large rotating rack thing in which all of those Arturia key steps, including the ones that have MIDI Club Juno controls on top of them, are built onto a nice sturdy rack that's mounted onto the wall and can pivot, as you've just seen. So that is now the sequencing center hub. And that can now control two Juno controls that are now patched directly into the mix rather than only into the mixing board. They're now basically going right into the mix bus without even EQ. And I'm going to see whether I can handle that. And then these run Zox boxes, although I could also assign them to something else. And with a bit of luck on the live stream, you'll be able to see them in action as well as hear them in action. And then the remaining stuff is like there is the Zox boxes I told you about. I built those from scratch. The little rack, the guitars are in more of a line. Those are the Junos that the Juno controls operate. The remaining key step is for bass. It's running a Yamaha FB01 into an equalizer, and I've not used that exact configuration before. That's my Farfisa organ, and that is the Fender Rhodes. And over here you can also see the cables there. I'm able to run a computer mix into my mixing board using those into the like bottom left corner of that. That's input jacks. So it's 16 input jacks, and I can patch stuff from the DAW into that if I want, using the dangling cable that you see over there. Up above you see a large light box, which is normally not in shot, and down below you see the MIDI verb, which inspired MV, and the mixing console, which is a cheesy old Roland M16. At some point I might actually try to do a new mixing console and build one of those from scratch as well. And I'll adjust the camera back again. Oh, and down on the floor over there is a heavily modified Epiphone Valve Jr. amplifier head. And the thing with the towels over it is an ISO cabinet. So yeah, it's like all of this kind of stuff, it's not necessarily all like pricey, expensive, fancy things. But, you know, if you're working in music for a while and able to just sort of build stuff up, you can accumulate things over the years and then be able to use that. So that works out pretty good. And yeah, I've said it numerous times, I think, David, I am kind of like an older version of David. And one of the funny things about American culture these days is that everything has to be shouted repeatedly, and only people who have a bunch of money are able to do anything. So that poses its own problems. Here, let me fiddle with this a little bit more. No, I don't think so. I don't think David was the specific Russian troll we're thinking of. But yeah, it's complicated. So yeah, often when you're doing streaming or whatever, you want to have some kind of interesting background. I just like mine to be functional, so all of that stuff actually works. And I will answer questions about any of it, or indeed demonstrate it. Though I might have to fire up some of the gear in order to do some of that. Like some of my audio inputs aren't engaged right now because it wasn't turned on. Coffee. I also grew up with this cup around, by the way. I'm very fond of it. When I was a kid, my folks had this cup. It is, I think, even labeled Italy 179HH. So I'm not sure exactly, but this is probably as old as me. And that's really old. Okay, so back to some questions, and we'll resume the normal operations of the live stream. I would say yes, absolutely. I think that a number of people are being thrown by daylight savings time. You see, to me, on Eastern Standard Time in the United States, it says that we are at 12:06 p.m. right now. So it says that it's just past noon. And I believe that does have to do with the daylight savings time changing over. Nothing much I can do about that other than say that it is in EST and hope that people can navigate the changes of there. I think that YouTube will at least tell you the rough amount of hours. So if it seems to be saying something that's unexpected, then you're probably discovering that. So Bernard has a question. What's the difference between Righteous 4 and Block Party? There's actually quite a lot of differences. Block Party is basically a compressor that distorts some and has a unusual way of handling its threshold. It's something that came out of one of these live streams, in fact, because we were talking about stuff, and the idea was like, what happens if you have a waveform? I'll do the negative lobe of the waveform. And your compression threshold is like this. So once you hit this point, you've got to turn down. Does it start turning it down so effectively that it just flat tops it and then starts falling off? In which case you make this sharp little point here, this edge, going right through that point, where there's a sudden change in trajectory. And in the Block Party video, I demonstrated doing that on the Apple peak limiter, because I'm able to make audible distortion be happening with the Apple peak limiter because it is kicking in. And I guess it doesn't have the kind of look ahead that some peak limiters would have. So what Block Party is doing is it's using the code from one corner clip so that when you start clipping, it's putting a clipping point lower than the absolute max clip, meaning that it's forcing you to go through this lower trajectory. And then, as if it's not doing the final clip, it'll continue expanding outwards and soften the edge a little bit. It's the same kind of tonal quality that you get out of one corner clip, where you can have bassiness coming through. And there's still a bunch of distortion to it that's still got, it's a sort of color personality style clipper. But it is simply a kind of compression distortion thingy, like so many of my stuff are. And it also has a hard clipper on its output to make absolutely sure that if you're using Block Party, you can use it as a final limiter. And it'll do the thing of final limiters where nothing will come through that is over the clipping point, no matter what. It's very thorough about that. It even has the clippy stage on the end of it just to make sure. That is actually post the dry-wet control. Because the idea is if you're heavily boosting into it but you want to get some cleanness out of it, you should be able to pull in dry content. And then even if your input signal is already clipping, including dry won't suddenly start giving you overs. Instead, including dry gives you a different style of final loudness management. Excuse me. Now, the difference between Block Party and Righteous 4 is this. Righteous 4 does a number of different things that are not anything like what Block Party is doing. Righteous 4 has dithering on the output, which probably could be updated to include the very most recent version of it. But the early Righteous was using Naturalize. I've had people fond of Naturalize, so maybe that's fine. And Righteous is designed so that the output includes its own dither and goes directly to the output. And the other thing about Righteous is that it's designed to replace pretty much your entire 2-bus. It doesn't include, at least not yet, console bus. So it's not literally, you have one plugin in your 2-bus and that's all you're allowed to have. Enjoy. But it's close to that because it's doing a lot of different kinds of processing. Righteous is capable of keeping track of like information that's distorting or soft clipping. Like Righteous will soft clip you so that it's taking waveforms and pulling them back a little bit as they get too far out. And then it's absorbing all of the energy that's being saved up from that and including it as a low frequency phenomenon that's being brought in using a kind of PAF nutty. So Righteous has PAF nutty inside it, which is also similar to what was being done by an earlier plugin called Shortbus. And it's modulating the second harmonic generation, because second harmonic generation offsets the weight of the center energy. Like if you were doing RMS loudness and averaging out the result so that you could tell what was being louder and what was not, and you were doing second harmonic generation, you'd start with a waveform kind of like that, and you'd end with something that was maybe something more like this, where one side of it would be greatly expanded and the other side would be shrunk down and minimized. And that's basically what the second harmonic generation does. All of a sudden, there's way more energy under one side of it than there is under the other side of it. Now, what Righteous does is it's doing that and it's modulating this phenomenon that can weight things in one direction or the other to feed back in the energy that got clipped off over here. So it's a really weird, complicated thing that's designed for trying to both saturate the audio and then retain some of the energy and feeding it back in the low bass. So it's an unusual behavior. Definitely an unusual behavior. Then there's also some slew limiting in there. I think it's limiting. It might be slew clipping. Basically, Righteous is your one-stop shop for getting a particular sound out of it, like you were running a particular hardware device. And you're doing that thing where like it's maybe I mix into the Dangerous 2-bus and that is the sound of my mixes or whatever. With Righteous, it would be like I'll mix into Righteous and Righteous will be the sound of my digital mix. Whereas Block Party is more a individual device that you could use in order to produce something like that. Also, Righteous had an initial goal in mind. What Righteous does is if you are mixing into it and you're pushing RMS loudness, like, low frequency waves and things like that, or distorted waves into it, Righteous will start obviously distorting before it actually clips out its peak energy. Righteous has stuff inside it that is capable of obviously distorting before you're even distorting the output bus. So the whole idea of Righteous, from the word go, was to make it so that you could hear a kind of saturation starting to happen in your mix and be able to sense when to sort of pull back and not push the levels so hard before the peak energy starts getting really stepped on. Because it'll let through peaks still. But the way that this behavior is set up, it kicks in a lot earlier than clipping the output. So basically, that's kind of... Righteous is more of a specialized case. Block Party is more of a generalized tool that you can use for, any form of limiting / distortion / slamming type thing. And they're both going to generate a bunch of artifacts on a sine wave because they're not simple compressors and they're not necessarily clean. They generate harmonics and things. In particular, Righteous does weird stuff, so it should sound good, but these are things that you feed mixes into more than simply test tones. So Morphe has a question that I can definitely cover, although I might need to write a bunch of stuff down on the pages to do that, about Benford realness. That's also my innovation. I didn't invent it, because otherwise it'd be called Johnson realness. But people weren't using it for audio before I got into it. Benford realness is a statistical calculation. Suppose you have a series of numbers, and you take your statistical number of some kind, like say you've got a set of natural data. And you got this value. It's like 5.1327145. And you got other natural values like 1.07342. Suppose you have just lots and lots and lots of these numbers. Just huge quantities of numbers that are supposedly from something real that you're measuring. Pick a spot to chop this off at, so you got only so many decimal places. How often are you going to run into each of those numbers? Well, the answer turns out to be it's not a perfectly even distribution. Instead, you'll start seeing different weighting based on, I guess that what ends up happening is you might have a number that is simply like that, and then everything else is zeros. And if you get rid of all the zeros, you're winding up with a 5. I could come up with a better way of explaining this if I spent some time and dug into what's doubtless on Wikipedia. There are ways of doing this. Point being, if you measured these things, you would wind up, say, taking a huge list of numbers like this. You're chopping it off in a certain point. You're taking the last digit, and you're going, how often do these digits come up? And because of this funny quality, where the digits aren't perfectly even all the time, but natural statistical distributions go a certain way, you wind up with a sequence that is different distributions rather than being perfect uniformity. And something that I can do while having all of this stuff live is go to, say, any of them would be as good, so I'll go to naturalize. And I'll load that stuff up. And what you'll see is that actually my distribution is not drawn correctly here. When you sample a particular spot like that, it starts getting manipulated by the fact that when you've got even number like this and it's all zeros, apparently you do count the zero. And since it's so much more likely at any given point to have additional zeros in, you start getting a manipulated distribution in which the zeros are more common to run across than anything else. I think Bernard Becker is probably just linked to it. Yep. I have every reason to believe that that is the correct link. So my numbers for starting out a Benford realness with the perfect balance of things is 0's 1,000, 1's 301, 2's 176, 3's 125, 4's 97, 5's 79, 6's are 67, 7's are 58, 8's 51, 9's are 46. And then I have a catch-all, which is 1,000 again for the tens case of anything that didn't fit in those. So what I will do when applying Benford realness to a dither is go and look at the output word of the thing and truncate it in both directions. One direction goes down, one direction goes up, and then look at what my final digit is going to be. I do that and I add it to an internal register, which is recording how many of those have happened. And then I compare the lot to what the ideal distribution is supposed to be. One of the choices, adding to one of them or adding to the other one, is going to be closer to the ideal distribution than the other, and that's the one that I'll choose. So at every stage, it's manipulating the sample data in such a way to maximize this realness distribution. And that's what the fundamental engine of everything from naturalized to not just another dither is based on, is this Benford calculation. Now, it's always the possibility I'm doing it wrong in some way, but I'm pretty sure I'm doing it correctly, and it is a process where it works out acting a lot like noise, but it also works out as acting like a live capture rather than a digital mixdown. So basically, even if you had artificial sounds like test tones that were designed to be extremely unnatural, and you applied naturalize or not just another dither to them, it would fight the unnaturalness of the test tone and force a more natural distribution of the truncation into it. And we hear that as real sounding audio rather than unnatural digital or processed sounding audio, because the distributions are perceived as a more natural versus a less natural sound. Like, it'll resist forming patterns that register as sounding fake. So that is my answer to Morphy's question. That's what Benford realness is. And you've had the Wikipedia link to Benford realness linked to, which hopefully will work for people. If not, web searching for it ought to be able to find that. And I'm simply applying that to sample data and using it to make a choice of whether to truncate upwards or downwards with any given sample value. It's actually a pretty good match. Like, one of the ways that you do this kind of thing Benford realness is used for studies of fraud. If you have, say, some kind of company and it's supplying stock market data or something like that, and you're wondering, like, are these people just making up their numbers? Like, is this fake? Are they just making up numbers in hopes of scamming somebody, and their information is not actually real? It's manufactured. Applying a Benford realness algorithm to that is very effective because it's extremely difficult to fabricate data and have it comply with this. Like, if you knew what you were doing, you would simply use, much like I'm applying it to dithering, you would simply use Benford realness to choose what data you made up. But people don't often do that. Instead, it's possible to find out many different kinds of phenomena in terms of whether things are natural sequences of numbers out of the natural world, or out of natural phenomena, or out of undoctored statistical phenomena. It's a way that large quantities of numbers fall into categories and have a kind of predictability to them. So there we are as far as that's concerned. Hopefully it is useful. I know that I've had a lot of people like the sound of it, and I'm thinking that that's probably why, because we end up being able to hear things like different kinds of unnaturalness. And we tend to not like kinds of unnaturalness. So the idea is to be able to fake it, basically. All right. So given that we're doing daylight savings time, now we are at 12:30. So I got another half an hour. Does anybody have a preference as to what I cover in our final half hour before I go on and do other stuff? I've been doing a lot of work on the studio, so I've more or less finished that. Dr. Bharat Singh Sambai. I am one of those Steve Jobs-like creatures. There's a reason that I am somewhat cautious when barging around with the very fancy, high-ender, educated guys. Like my interactions with Alexei Lukin of Isotope, for instance, were very strongly colored by this. There are folks out there who have gone through all the study and done maths and things and graduated from MIT, as Alexei did, if I'm not mistaken. I did not. And, there's a bunch of people who did not realize that there was daylight savings time. Okay, well, we'll clearly have something to talk about for the last half hour. So my formal education is a horrific series of school-style disasters, largely driven by my autism, and dropping out of college in a blaze of failure and catastrophe, including, like, one of my friends committed suicide. I got into a crazy band, and we were very heavily on drugs, and there was a lost summer where I tried to work with this band, and things were really going nowhere. It was a big mess. My youth was a big mess. And my schooling was a big mess because it was always an enormous struggle. So my formal education has become having to learn this stuff on my own anyway, because I wasn't able to get it out of schools. I wasn't able to relate in that way. So I basically just had to do the same work the hard way. And there are many things that I'm missing as far as that's concerned. Like, there are things about programming and things about mathematics that I really don't know about. So when people bring them to my attention, I try to learn them. But by the same token, that also means I did not pick up some of the base assumptions of the fields that people study. So I'm capable of doing things like attempting a dither based on the Benford realness calculation because I was never taught that that was nonsensical. There's a lot of stuff going on that, if you've ever heard of the book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance by a man named Robert Pirsig, that is worth looking into. And his experience parallels mine in some ways, although he was a fellow who was, good at school and very brilliant, and he ended up becoming a professor, a credentialed professor. But he had a breakdown because he was trying to work out the underlying reality of things and scientific truth. I'm not a wizard mathematician. I'm an experimenter. It's not quite the same thing. Pirsig was trying to get at the nature of truth, the nature of reality, and ran into an issue where he wasn't able to pin down scientific truth because every time he thought he had things nailed down, he discovered that the truth that people understood turned out to be only a limited understanding, that more was revealed later. And ran across somebody, I forget exactly what the context was, who was like, oh yeah, truth is a function of time. And Pirsig was like, wait, what? What are you talking about? Because that was something of a complete invalidation of all scientific theory. This idea that you can always go to a deeper truth by getting another intuitive light bulb moment and coming with a new depth of understanding about what things can mean. If that's true, like, people used to plot the solar system out based on epicycles, and then you've got Kepler with the gravitational system and a solar system that was heliocentric instead of Earth-centric. And Pirsig looked at the history of science and saw that it was all like that, and there was no reason to believe that the future was going to be any different. That the idea that we have reached what scientific understanding is, and so from now on nothing is going to change or happen, was basically madness. So Pirsig had a breakdown as a result of this because he was a working college professor and caring very deeply about truth and reality, and then formed basically a New Age book rather than scientific discovery. He basically took scientific study and turned it into a kind of spiritual study or philosophy, and had a successful book, also had a continuing tragic life. If I'm not mistaken, his kid committed suicide, and he wound up struggling and having relationships with people which he was trying to figure out whether they had quality or not. And he did a book called Lila, if I'm not mistaken, which was after much of this tragedy, and was largely devoted to the idea of whether this woman that he was engaged with at the time was a quality person or not. But the Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance book was, and is, quite amazing in the sense of being another snapshot of a philosophical understanding, and also a work of literature, a work of very fine literature. Because it's a very powerful book, even if it's maybe slightly fictionalized. I was just thinking of a parallel. It's one that I've got kicking around in sort of bathroom reading. So I have this large collection of books that I just have available to read all the time. And I've been rereading a book about the Rolling Stones. The True Adventures of the Rolling Stones by Stanley Booth. Stanley Booth had a path that was not dissimilar to Robert Pirsig in some ways. Oh, okay, I get it. Yeah, so that was Eric Clapton's kid jumped off of a roof or something, but Pirsig lost his kid, who features heavily in the story of Motorcycle Minions, by the way. Stanley Booth wrote a book about the Rolling Stones right at the period that they were going from their early stuff through Altamont. And Stanley Booth was literally with the Rolling Stones at Altamont and wrote a kind of biography of the Rolling Stones with this extraordinary poetic vision and historical breadth. And Stanley Booth was sort of a young, drug-crazed Okefenokee cracker, and a astrologer told the Rolling Stones, who they asked about, should we let this guy write a book? And they were like, yep, he'll write the book and he will lose everything but his life. And much like Pirsig, Booth wrote this one extraordinary, amazing book. And then, don't mind me, I've just dropped a pen. Maybe I'm done with that pen for the time being. And as far as I know, it hasn't followed it up with anything nearly as amazing. But there was that one extraordinary production, a literary masterpiece. Interesting kind of thing when you end up having a life like that. I wonder whether it's the sort of thing that I would want. I don't think I'm on that path or anything like it. Rather than be the person that produces a amazing artwork of any kind, particularly, and then burns out or pays everything for it and never manages to do that. Instead, I seem to be just plugging along, trying to help people, and having a very different path, and that's fine with me. There is that ambition of wanting to make the creative masterwork. I just don't think it's going to happen for me. But apart from maybe fan fiction, but that would be just cosmic humor in action. Anyways, we are at 12:38. I got about 20 minutes or so going on. Got the clock that I referred to seems to have stopped, so I'll just be basing things on the computer for that. And do we have other questions? Because there's a bunch of people who have come in thinking that I was going to start an hour late, so they missed an hour of live stream. And I want to be able to answer any questions or observations that they've got while they're kicking around. So what have you got? Do we have anything that I need to talk about in the last 20 minutes or so? While you're doing that, I'm going to go and pick up that pen that I dropped. Here we are. I suppose it's also possible that people wandered off or I ran out of questioners. Here's a couple. So the DIY things, Bernard, I'm not sure quite what you mean, but giving a sum over PayPal, I have been avoiding taking sums over PayPal because people keep trying to do that. It's not particularly safe. PayPal will mess with you as bad or worse than anything Patreon would ever do. And as far as DIY, that's anything that I'm building in DIY and showing people how to do is like the plugins. I'll do that stuff for myself. I'm not necessarily distributing them. And you're supposed to watch what I'm doing and do likewise. That's what the DIY thing is supposed to be about. So that is covered under the Patreon thing. If you feel that there's anything in the DIY that was so useful to you that it counts like a plugin, then tack other money onto your Patreon thing or whatever. You're thinking in terms of the one that's a Kickstarter. You're thinking in terms of Kickstarters. that would depend. Like, the idea of trying to run a Kickstarter in order to be able to distribute large amounts of like DIY kits makes sense to me. I'm not there yet. I will be developing like some of the stuff that I'm building. Like you can see the occasional thing. Oh, there's a new thing actually, which I hadn't mentioned. I'll use this pen that I dropped as a pointer. So here's my stuff, and what you see here underneath this little wire is a thing that has a chip on it, and it's marked S. That is a subwoofer, a sub-harmonic generator, and it is an octave divider. I've got a patch through here so that it runs with the synthesizer, and I built that. That's a DIY thing. This is new. This used to be sort of bolted onto that little cigar box, and I have set up my Axolotl experimenter board on a piece of perf board that can plug into the Eurorack and be powered by the Eurorack. So there is somewhere around here. Yeah. Right over here is the Eurorack header where I plugged the power supply stuff into. So this is plugged into the rack unit itself, and it's being powered by it. I've got audio ins and outs. I've got a bunch of sort of chip ins and outs that are providing trigger pulses, but they're reprogrammable, so they could also be inputs. I've got a USB cable plugged in, and I can plug a USB cable to reprogram it. And that is live and working and running on a perf board. And this is something that people have not been able to do really very much yet. Normally people build these little panels, and it's another form of DIY thing, but they're doing 3D printing and making little boxes. And the Eurorack, the Axolotl board, it's assembled into a little box, but I've never seen anybody actually split the board because you have to break the MIDI panel off and reconnect it somewhere else, and then build the DIY thing of any kind that you could bolt this kind of stuff to. Instead, it always seems to be just making a standalone desktop box. So this would be worth doing some kind of DIY trick with, because it's a fairly small and tidy assemblage of things. I probably have room for another pair of jacks, and the board does have enough connections for another pair of jacks. And again, you can reprogram the jacks to be inputs or outputs depending upon how you want to use them. And if you don't have other circuitry and you're just wiring the jacks directly to the board, as I've done, they're very weak outputs. They're like 3-volt outputs, which is enough to drive some things. And the inputs will blow up if you run stuff into them, so I'm not using them as inputs myself. And the whole system, if you just wire it directly like that, the whole system is a lot more fragile. But the board only costs $69 anyway, so I'm not really worried about it. It's like if I blow up the board, I'll get another one. I know where to go for them. And that's a potential DIY thing. Now let me keep skipping around because I've got more questions and I've got about 15 minutes to go. David Pixley, also known as the Muzzle Mastering. Do I find Restreaming Madness annoying? No, as long as I don't have to legally respect it. If I wound up legally required to interact and license my stuff around in order to do that, that would start getting annoying. But as long as it's just kind of underground craziness, do what you want, just don't expect me to interact heavily with it. It's a sort of a back and forth kind of thing. A mixed party session based on a multi-track example. I don't have any multi-track examples. Like David was asking me this just the other day. Like, please give me stems. I don't have any stems. I'm not mixing stuff in the box. I'm mixing stuff on a board. So what you hear out of the multi-track thing is literally coming off the board. I'd be just as able to do it live and run it into a PA system without a computer or a synthesizer or anything. Well, all the synthesizers. High pass and low pass, are they getting updated? Well, they're getting the floating point dither when I finally roll that stuff out. There may be further things I can do with them, but I mean, bear in mind, high pass has had like Hermie pass. 2 Vinyl also contains high passes. There's been a lot of high passes, honestly. So it depends upon whether I come up with something legitimately interesting to do with them. Until then, high pass and low pass can exist sort of as they are. If there's anything that is severely busted with them, then that's fine. But bear in mind that a lot of the stuff that I'm doing, it like works between the values of 0 and 1. And I intentionally avoid tying things to frequency response and stuff because I intend for you to use your ears on this stuff. So I can't do multi-tracks because I'm not working with them. High pass and low pass not being hints about FX chains. Remember, I'm working in analog. That's where my inspiration is. Since I'm working in analog, I don't tend to have plug-in chains that I routinely use because I don't. When I do plugins, it's with the goal of matching or rivaling the stuff that I'm doing in analog. I'm not coming from the place of being a digital guy at heart. So that's where all the audio, the analog-based stuff and emulating the behavior of those comes from, is that I'm not really doing FX chains that much. There are some exceptions. For instance, this MIDI verb has a sidechain input which powers an LED that is connected to... Here, I'll show you. This is a little bit more final drawing while I'm doing this. I'm doing an electric circuit for this stuff. So, audio goes to a LED. Actually, I've got a additional thing in here. Let me increasingly sketch this out. I'm going to tell you what this is because I'm probably drawing it wrong. The output of one of the channels of my mixing board goes through a bridge rectifier, which is converting the pluses and minuses into just positive voltage that goes to this thing that drives an LED, and there's also capacitors. It's represented as a single capacitor that will store energy from this and make the LED stay lit for longer. Like if you light it up, it'll take a while for the LED to go away. And that's off of the output of it. And then the LED drives 2 cadmium sulfide photocells inside the device. And those are wired to the output of the MIDI verb. They're just jumpered across something, because if you put light onto a CDS cell that goes from very high resistance, like 1 megohm or more, maybe 10 megs with darkness, with no light, and it'll go down to 1K or 100 ohms or something. You shine bright light on a CDS cell and the resistance goes down. So what that's doing is inside this MIDI verb, I've got the connection going from the output of the mixing board. It's the monitor output. And I'm not using it, I'm using it pretty much only on my kick drum. That is powering this separate output, and the sole purpose of the output is to drive a LED directly. With a line output from a mixing board will do that. It's strong enough to do that. So would a Eurorack thing easily. and the LED lights up and causes the photocells to go to a lower value. That's also a circuit called the Vactrol. Eurorack has often used Vactrols for things. Like you can have signal going from one lead of the photocell through the photocell to the other lead of the photocell. That is how an LA2A compressor works, I believe. And the photocell also has trajectories of turning on and off that give a characteristic compressor sound. So optocompressor, as you might see on many plugins, is modeling the behavior of this actual real-world device that works in this way. It doesn't turn on super fast. It doesn't turn off super fast. It'll take a while to go from one state to the other. And in the case of the MIDI verb, both of those CDS cells are shorting the output to ground. So if it lights up enough, then it will cut off the volume and make it go quieter. Whereas if you're running the signal through it, it would make it go louder if the light was on. So that is like an FX chain, except for that it's in the real world and it's using physical objects. So I missed Zafor's question. I had a question earlier if you want to give input. Yeah, I've got to restate that because I didn't see where it was. Morphe, you need high pass and low pass to work at high sample rates? That's odd because I would have thought that it would. I'd like to know, first of all, what it's doing wrong, and then I will look into it. Because if it's definitely not working, see, I'm not experiencing that, so. Is it just that you're not able to dial it into the settings that you want, or is it that it changes if you switch between the two? Because in some of these things, they're supposed to change when you switch between the two. Making a note, HP and LP high sample rate. So let me know if there's specifics as what it's doing or not doing. It should be still doing something, much the same. Dr. Brett saying, if you've given a thought about working with an established DAW, nobody's been asking me, and they'd have to be able to work with me the way that I'm doing. Like there are systems of like there is some project that is doing a sample playback engine, and they've incorporated all of my stuff because it's MIT licensed, and so they can. But I'm not actively working with them. They're just able to tap into the open source stuff that I've put out there. Often they don't need me to directly work with them. If they want to start using my stuff and they can work with an MIT license, which is very flexible, then they can work with me without me having to do anything, and that's kind of handy. Would I open source my code for the dynamics analysis stuff that I did in the Evergreen stuff? Yes, I would, but it's not the kind of code that I can conveniently open source. I can't put out real basic code because nobody uses that now. Or at least those who do, it would be a strange choice. So that's waiting, and that's also something that I'm kind of reserving in hopes of driving some of these higher goals and things. There's only so much that I can do while frantically giving everything away as fast as I can. So I got to reach certain goals before I start doing anything with that. Would I add another live stream goal where I would go on Ninjam? I don't know what Ninjam is. But jamming live with top patrons, the trouble with jamming live online is there's only so many ways of doing it. Like you could be working with MIDI loops and add or subtract notes over the internet, because then latency between computers on the internet doesn't matter. Everybody has their own loops, and the stuff that you add or subtract into that stuff can be synchronized because you're sort of composing on the fly and adding or subtracting things. I have every intention of coming up with an online way of letting people alter the configuration of, say, This guy. The axolotl that is the heart of my system does various things. It's got these different outputs, and they control different things, like the drums, the Moog synthesizer and stuff. I've got all these triggers that can be used to do stuff. And since it's a computer, in theory, I should be able to communicate with it so that people over the internet can like type stuff into chat and say override the tempo, which would be not fun. That would be a mess. But in theory, it's possible to have the chat set the tempo at any given moment. So I'd be playing along with things, and all of a sudden it's going twice as fast as it did before, or it's doing some terrible thing. Or it's like, Twitch plays music, where everybody gets to manipulate the tempo by a tenth of a beat per minute. So people just kind of slower, 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 slower. And it becomes one of those Twitch plays Pokemon things. That is doable. It would depend upon who was watching and what they wanted, but it's very doable. And that would be a kind of interactivity. However, I don't intend to make that a goal. That's just a project that could happen at some point. Plugins behaving better in OS X? Probably not, but the AUs do have better labeling because the most primitive VST labeling and controls are pretty primitive. OS X has more sophistication for handling of generic interface stuff. They kind of made it be a little bit more. How can I get a FET compressor? I think that would depend upon what you define as a FET compressor. All of my stuff is plugin compressors. So although I've sometimes tried to emulate things like opto compressors and stuff, I would just have to tell you, experiment with the plugin compressors that I make without worrying too much about whether they are specifically like FET compressors or not. That said, Logical might be one of the closer things that you'd get to a FET compressor. So I would direct you towards Logical to try first. That beard should be illegal. Hate to break it to you, this beard is illegal. No, just kidding. Did there float massive update? I am working on getting a little more support for my migration to a different web host. And one of the first things that will come from that is when I do have that geared up, and I've got somebody who's offering his services for free, but by that very token, it's like I got to wait around until he has free time, which he may or may not ever have. So we'll see where that goes. But the massive update will happen when I have the new web hosting at least set up to the point where I have a file server I can place everything on. And that's the easiest part, but it's still waiting on somebody else's interactivity. I hope I'm one of the top audio DSP guys, or maybe it's a shame that I'm one of the top audio DSP guys, because people should be able to do better than this, but it helps to be able to take a really unusual point of view on things, and I've always been good at that. Okay, MIDI verb sidechain. I missed it then. Well, I'm glad that I filled it in now. Good night, Dr. Brett. Opto compressor sidechain. It's kind of like it's a Vactrol. It is a opto gain manipulator thing that isn't really tied into a compressor so much as an entirely separate input. So Morphe is filling me in a little bit on the low pass high pass thing. Thank you for getting back into it. Okay, let me note down what is happening there. I can experiment with it a little bit. And I've got a feedback on Zophor's earlier question, so I'll get to that in a moment. I'm writing 0 at high rate, filter engaged. Yeah, I'll fix that. I've seen you've mentioned this before. It's just I have so many irons in the fire that stuff gets lost. I'll fix that. That can maybe be one of my next things so that I can just dive into it, get it right, and then that'll be one of my things for upcoming weeks. Evan Kim, I did not. More's the pity. Bo recorded 2 tracks in the Oh, how do I play all the instruments at the same time? They play themselves. These are sequencers. The little white keyboards are Arturia key steps, so you can play in sequences and they will continue playing them for up to 64 steps at various different speeds. So some of these things, like the synthesizers, you can program to just start going and they will go at whatever pulse it is that you set, or they have internal sequencers, or that panel here controls the axolotl so that you can be running a sequence and then it will transpose it. The sliders are set up so that they will do a transpose at a certain number of bars, so I can get a longer range cycling effect going there. And I can have from 2 to up to 24 sections being which sliders are being used. And those are based on also what scene you're on, because I can switch from like 1 to 9 to 10 to 18 and so on. And then bars is how fast it cycles through those. So there's a lot of stuff that these things can play for themselves. There is no analog multitrack. Instead, it is an elaborate synthesizer system. Take your robes off, big guy. I'll pay. No, you won't. And no, I won't. I think that YouTube doesn't even appreciate male-presenting nipples, much less female-presenting nipples. So I'm going to behave myself there. I don't know whether people want me shirtless. I do actually lift weights, so I show up pretty well shirtless, but that can't happen on Twitch and that can't happen on YouTube streaming, and I'm not sure where it can. Anyways, logical for feel. Howdy, Chris. Yeah, drums and guitars going. Guitars are always live, and sometimes the synthesizer stuff is also live, but synthesizer stuff can also be driven off of these, which are sequencers. I have those little LEDs sitting there. I'm pointing where you can't actually see them. But the one over there also has a little LED poking up on the right side of it. And that lights up when a note is being played out of the sequencer. It is an LED that is stuck into the trigger CV output. So the CV output will play at the same time as it's sending MIDI to the synthesizers. And so you can see that blinking, and it shows you which ones are playing notes through the synths. And the drums, they're very obviously techno drums, so I'm obviously not playing those drums live. And that is definitely being generated by Eurorack stuff. I hope to eventually develop more Eurorack stuff to be able to do more interesting drums than I've got. So, well, thank you, Project. I'm hoping that works out pretty well for people. So it is now 1:05. I'm sorry for the daylight savings time, but that's an annoying Americanism thing. Yeah, no, Bo, honestly, I am not multi-tracking anything in Logic. All of that is live. There are other people who do this kind of thing using modular synthesizers, And I just thought it was the coolest thing ever, so I decided that I was going to start doing that with my own music, and I've been doing it ever since. And I'll take it a step farther in that typically when I'm doing these jams on Tuesdays, it doesn't start from anything that's been pre-recorded. I'm generally assembling stuff on the fly, starting from either zero or starting from some patch on the modular synthesizer that's got stuff set up that I think will be useful as instruments to play on. Like right now, I've got the Bastel Castells patched through to the mixing board so that I can have their industrial noises and stuff coming through at any moment if I like. And I've also got the sync patched through to the Axolotl so that the Bastel Castells are in tempo with everything else. Often I use the Bastel Castells to drive the Blue Lantern, which is the hi-hat sound that I use, which I quite like. I like that. And bear in mind, deadmau5's loudness. deadmau5 is not that loud. deadmau5 is a good example of not necessarily mixing stuff to be over loud. What he's got is very good sound design on particular elements like kick drums and things. The guy really knows how to put together electronic stuff that has a good feel and a really intense attack. He's designing the sounds to do that. It's not that he's necessarily doing it with like peak limiting or something. Quite the contrary. deadmau5 has very clean mix buses. In fact, I think a lot of the time he's using an Eve console. So if you are approaching that type of thing, think in terms of original sound design. Do not think in terms of trying to get at a deadmau5 thing by running a mix with lots of plugins and everything. You really need to run a cleaner setup and just design your sounds more carefully. Fair enough? I mean, certain kinds of tones will just eat up lots of space, and a lot of it is just arrangement. Okay, I'm sorry, Bernard, for not announcing time changes. It kind of snuck up on me, too. I wasn't expecting the daylight savings time. It's like, oh, God, today? Oh, no, okay. And there you are. So, it would be fun if I was to analyze deadmau5's output on my evergreens analysis kind of stuff, but I don't think that I'm actually likely to do that. That's the sort of thing where, I'm looking more at the old records, but I'd be making some of the same points. Because that is another guy who argues against loudness war and against slamming everything to within an inch of its life. I am with him in that. I'd like to hang out with the guy sometime, talk gear or software or something like that. Anyways, on that note, I will bid you folks good day, and maybe I'll catch up with some of you tomorrow for the music stream, where I will not see anything that you say because they don't have that set up yet, but I'll be using some of this new arrangement of the stuff that I've had around for years. And Wednesday, unless people like massively skyrocket the Patreon until it like hits $1,500 by Wednesday, which I think is impossible, then there won't be a live stream on Wednesday. But that's when the Evergreen stream will start happening, when it does start happening. And I'll catch you guys next week. Talk to you later.